Good morning. My name is Anita Gustafson, and I am the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at Mercer University, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the students, faculty, staff, and administration of Mercer University. I'd like to welcome you to the 2022 Walter B. and K.W. Shurden Lectures on Religious Liberty and the Separation of Church and State. Today's lecture is hosted by the Roberts Department of Religion at the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. I want to give a special welcome to our speaker, the Reverend Dr. J Augustine, and we'll hear more about him in just a little bit. This series is made possible due to the generosity of Dr. Walter B. Shurden and Dr. K.W. Shurden of Macon. I'm privileged to call them friends and have appreciated the warm welcome they have given my family and me when we relocated to Macon. In 2004, the Shurdens made a gift to the Washington, D.C.-based Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, the BJC, to establish an annual lectureship on the issues of religious liberty and the separation of church and state. A nationally noted church historian, Dr. Walter B. Shurden is founding executive director of the Center for Baptist Studies and a minister at large for Mercer. He served at the university for almost 25 years as Callaway Professor of Christianity in the Roberts Department of Religion in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. During 18 of those years, he served as chair of the department. Dr. K.W. Shurden is a retired professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in Mercer's School of Medicine. She is a noted author and maintains a practice in counseling and supervision. Designed to enhance the ministry and programs of the BJC, the lectures are held at Mercer every 3 years and at another university, college, or seminary the other years. Founded in 1936, the BJC is a leading voice in Washington, D.C., fighting to uphold the historic Baptist principle of religious freedom. It stands guard at the intersection of church and state, defending the first freedom of the First Amendment by protecting both the free exercise of religion and defending against its establishment by government. The BJC is composed of representatives of 15 national, state, and regional Baptist bodies and supported by thousands of churches and individuals across the country. It is the only faith-based agency devoted solely to the religious liberty and the institutional separation of church and state. The BJC believes that a threat to anyone's religious liberty is a threat to everyone's religious liberty. It's now my pleasure to introduce Amanda Tyler, the Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dean Gustafson, for that warm welcome and that wonderful introduction of BJC and, of course, of the Shurdens here today. Well, what an honor and a pleasure it is to be back at Mercer University and to be able to partner again for this 17th annual Walter B. and K.W. Shurden Lectures on religious liberty and the separation of church and state. And thank you so much to President and Mrs. Underwood and the entire administration of Mercer for having us back on campus this year. As the dean said, BJC is a coalition of individuals, churches, and more than a dozen different Baptist denominational bodies working together to educate about and advocate for faith freedom for all. And we really do mean all. We don't just do this for Baptists, but also for Buddhists, for Methodists, and for Muslims, for Anglicans, and for atheists, because we do think that a threat to anyone's religious freedom is a threat to everyone's religious freedom. For 86 years now, we've headquartered our work on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., but defending faith freedom for all takes place in communities across our country, including on college campuses and universities just like this one. I hope that you will learn more about BJC on our website, bjconline.org, and on social media, at BJC on the Hill, and you can join us on social media today using the hashtag Shurden Lectures. I also want to point out that in your programs today, there are 2 QR codes, and you can use your phone to sign up to join our mailing list. And we have a different QR code, whether you are a student or you are not a student today. So please sign up to get updates from BJC. I also want to thank 2 members of our team who are here with us today for all of their work to make these lectures possible. In the back of the room, we have Director of Education, Charles Watson Jr., and our Director of Strategic Partnerships, Dan Hamill. Thank you both. I also, of course, want to thank Buddy and Kay Shurden, who are here with us today, for their generous gift to endow these lectures on college campuses. As the dean said, we travel across the country bringing these lectures to communities across the country on college and university campuses. The Shurdens, of course, being educators here at Mercer, knew the importance of education to the continuation of religious liberty, and they wanted to see the gift of their impact in their lifetime, while also continuing the gift for generations to come. Thank you, Buddy and Kay, so much for your vision and for your generosity in bringing these lectures to Mercer and other communities. Well, our distinguished lecturer this year is the Reverend Dr. J Augustine. You can read his impressive and distinguished biography in your programs, but I do want to note a few highlights. You will see that Dr. Augustine serves in many different roles. I do not know how you find the time to do all of these things. He is senior pastor of St. Joseph AME Church in Durham, North Carolina. He is a missional strategist with the Duke Center for Reconciliation, and he's a law professor at North Carolina Central University. Dr. Augustine is a native of New Orleans and has degrees from Howard University, Tulane Law School, United Theological Seminary, and Duke University. He also, in addition to all of this, recently published a new book. It's called Called to Reconciliation: How the Church Can Model Justice, Diversity, and Inclusion. And in these challenging days for our country and for religious freedom in particular, his multidisciplinary approach is exactly what I think we need to hear today. BJC is honored to work with Dr. Augustine to promote religious freedom and racial justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. J Augustine.
Thank you so much again. Thank you so much. Good morning, my friends. Good morning. I want you to know it is my absolute honor and a pleasure to be with you, and I want to begin by saying thank you, in particular, to a couple of folks. Obviously, Amanda, Charles, and Dan, the BJC family. I am so thankful for your warm embrace of me and for the opportunity to share with you. For this wonderful university community, I've been on both campuses now in Atlanta and here in Macon, and I'm so grateful to President Underwood, who is probably being the president right now, but I see Mrs. Underwood, so thank you so much for coming out this morning. It's an honor to be in your presence again. I also want to say thank you, as Amanda referenced, to the Shurdens for their foresight, for them sowing a seed that will produce, that will show produce, I should say, for years and years to come. So I am grateful to be a part now of this lecture family. I want to navigate the physical boundaries I'm in. Charles asked me as we were miking up this morning, he said, now, do you want to be the preacher or do you want to be the lawyer? Right? So I said, let me be the lawyer, because the lawyer in me says I'm comfortable when I'm talking to 12 people in a box, right? Now, you all are a little bit more than 12, but the concept remains the same. I like to move around a little bit when I talk. I want to focus this morning on many of the divisions we have in the United States of America and how those divisions, large in part, are correlated to or emanate from religion and the free exercise thereof. So the presentation I'd like to share with you is Religious Liberty and Christian Nationalism, a Political History and a Problematic Present. Much of what I will talk about, I appreciate Amanda's reference to my writings. Much of what I will talk about is found in 2 books. One of them is available now. The other, if we can just get past the final edits, right? If we can just get past the final edits. If we can just get past the final edits. But Call to Reconciliation was published last month on February the 8th. Much of what I detail in terms of the historical part of today's lecture is found in there. A call, I believe, a clarion call, I believe, for the church to be an exemplar for society and for us to end the polarity and find the common ground we need here in the United States of America. The other work is When Prophets Preach. It will be published by Fortress Press, hopefully later this year, in worst case scenario, the earlier part of next year. Again, if we can just get the final edits, But it is a book that shows how prophetic leadership, the prophetic leadership domain in the church, has influenced society with the proverbial expression, speaking truth to power. I like to say speaking truth to institutions of power. So when government does things that is wrong, or that are wrong rather, someone must stand up, the prophet must preach. The infusion of that is what you will see in today's lecture. If there is a thesis statement, if there is a fundamental point I want to focus on, it's that America's undercurrent of civil religion has created a game of political ping pong, where Christian nationalists are playing us versus them. And this us versus them is destroying the very concept of democracy as we know it in the United States of America. This lecture, the second one, will focus on history and how we got to this point of political polarity. Houston, we have a problem. Christian nationalists, I believe, and Christian nationalism is destroying democracy. I believe it's the greatest threat we have to democracy, and we saw it on full display January the 6th, 2021. We've seen threats to democracy not just with the January 6th insurrection, but voter suppression laws that are on the books now in multiple jurisdictions, and it is not lost on me that I am on Georgia soil, because the Georgia legislature has led the way in the most reprehensible ways, if I can speak truth to power and call out what I see as unjust. Texas is leading the way in being unjust. Multiple state legislatures in the wake of the 2020 election are being unjust, and we're going to unpack some of that today. I believe also here there is an improper use with Christian nationalism, and I'm trying to unpack what exactly it is. There is an improper use of a very polarizing wedge issue called critical race theory. Now, I studied critical race theory in law school 20 plus years ago. I've been a full semester of my life studying in a law school, not in college, not in high school, not in elementary school, not in middle school, in a law school, in a graduate program. We are in a place of political polarity now where we're asking Supreme Court justices or nominees for the Supreme Court about their views on critical race theory in private schools, where that absolutely has no place. It begs the question, what does this have to do with the price of tea in China? It's being used, my point, as a wedge issue to try to continue to divide society and fracture where we are. It was successfully used, I believe, in the Virginia gubernatorial election last year, and the forecast is out. You're going to see a lot more of it, as you saw in the Supreme Court hearings. You're going to see a lot more of it over the course of this year in approaching the midterm elections. The outline that I'd like to follow to be with you today, framing the issues, sort of a historical overview where we have been, looking at colonial church and state relations from 1607 and jumping all the way to 1955, giving some high points and overviews there. 1955 was really a turning point in terms of the prophetic witness of how religion and society interacted, how the church interacted with the secular world, with the beginning of the civil rights movement, tracing it back to December 1st, 1955, with Martin Luther King Jr.'s activism as motivated by Rosa Parks' heroism. Then there was a critical issue that came about in 2013. I referenced this last night, Shelby County v. Holder, a Supreme Court decision that really gutted what I believe was the most significant and most empirically measurable, if you want to measure success, the most empirically measurable indicator of success of the civil rights movement was passage of the Voting Rights Act. The Shelby County v. Holder decision gutted critical provisions of the Voting Rights Act, and as a result of that, you're seeing stop the steal legislation and state legislatures running amok in terms of what I call democracy and protecting the rights of those who need protecting. I want to conclude, because we are just a couple of days before the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, by posing the proverbial question that he raised in his fourth and final book: where do we go from here? Because America has been in a mess. But I optimistically believe we can do better. Now, what I would like to do in terms of the lecture, a lecture has such a formal connotation, doesn't it though, right? I want to have a conversation with you. I am somebody who is deeply an extrovert. I enjoy interacting with people. I'm going to date myself by letting you know one of the movies I want to avoid, a sort of an assimilation here, I want to avoid Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Y'all remember Ferris Bueller's Day Off? You remember the scene? Bueller? Anyone? Bueller? So I want you to feel comfortable to talk. Please feel comfortable to talk. And if I can share with you honestly, I'm a pastor in the black church tradition. If they don't talk back to me on Sunday, I don't feel like I'm doing a good job, right? So I want you to feel comfortable is what I'm saying, to talk. All right. First up, I want to give a foundation for colonial perspectives on religious liberty, 1607 to 1776. It's very interesting, though, in this world in which we live now, where critical race theory is being used for what it is not, but being used as a wedge issue. Let's be clear. Don't you dare say 1619, because the powers that be don't want you to talk about enslavement and when slaves were brought to America as chattel property. That is part of American history, just like the Italian immigration to America, just like any other ethnic group coming into America. This was the quote-unquote melting pot of yesteryear. But in terms of these original perspectives, I believe, from the colonial period, two things become very apparent. America is not a Christian nation, and religious liberty also says I can own slaves, because God told me this is what's appropriate under a manifest destiny sort of framework. Now, in thinking about perspectives from 1607 to 1776, Roger Williams, the Baptists love to lift up Roger Williams, right? Roger Williams makes a plea for religious liberty, meaning we want to get away from what was done in England. We don't want the back and forth of church and state relations. We want an independent place of democracy. John Locke has a letter concerning toleration. He is express in advocating this new place should be much more concerned about secular activities and much less concerned about spiritual activities. Let individuals have their own spirituality and let them have their own guiding principles when it comes to their God, whether they choose to worship a God or not. Along with Roger Williams' plea for religious liberty and John Locke's letter concerning toleration, there still is a Puritan covenant theology. And this covenant theology is, I believe, almost a basis for where we are now in terms of a conflation of church and state, because it says that America has a covenant with God, much like Israel had a covenant with God. A chosen place God has put his hand on, and this new land is blessed, so there's certain responsibilities we have to stay in accord with God's will. It's a dangerous conflation, but it's part of the history, part of the foundation for what we had here in America. But with this decision of all of the back and forth that was part of our background or part of the history in England, when we got here to America, after the Constitution was adopted, its first amendment passed in 1791 says that we will not have church and state together. And the religion clauses say, Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So our foundational issues gave us the two religion clauses in the First Amendment. English settlers didn't want the back and forth that led to the English Reformation. We didn't want a Bloody Mary again. We didn't want the problems and the violence that ensued because of the unification of church and state as it existed in England. We didn't want a state church, for example, the Anglican Church of England. We don't want the Church of the United States. We want people to have absolute religious liberty to do as God governs them, or if they say there's no God at all, that's fine too, because we want to make sure this is a place where we don't respect religion in that regard. So a real freedom to exercise religion. Am I making sense? Y'all not talking back to me. It makes me nervous. Okay. All right. Now, a little bit more about that free exercise of religion. The knife cuts both ways. What's very interesting to me is there were racial hostilities rising up because in terms of the institution of slavery, this is the way God intended it to be. Some would look at, from a theological basis or from a biblical basis, some would look at the Genesis 9 narrative and say that there is a such thing as the curse of Ham, a curse that goes on to those who would later come from or emanate from Canaan, a people of darker skin. So this is God's plan for the providence of America. Part of that covenant theology says this is a place where God is established and people of darker skin are supposed to be subservient to those of lighter skin. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm only letting you know this is a part of one of the theologies that's been out there in existence. And this emanates from religious liberty. There's been a concept of American exceptionalism that emanated from the Revolutionary War, suggesting that we are different than anyone else. America is set apart. We're a city up on a hill. So because we are set apart, there are certain rules that we don't have to abide by because we're the United States of America. This has been influenced largely by theology and a manifest destiny that says we are supposed to be, we have God's providence, we have God's blessing, so we're supposed to set the course for this North American continent. We're supposed to set the course of the world. We're the United States of America. We have God's favor. That's a dangerous conflation when you talk about relationships with sister nations, I believe. But all of this comes from the free exercise of religion. What I want to do now is pivot just a little bit to talk about the historical tension between piety and politics in America. Let me be clear also, when I use the term politics, I am not at all talking in a partisan context. I make no insinuation of Republican or Democrat, red or blue, independent, green, none of the above. I am suggesting that in the true sense of the term, politics refers to affairs of the cities. It deals with people and interaction among individuals. So religion and politics have long been connected in the United States. Now, prophetic leadership rose up in the church during the period of enslavement. I'm taking you on a historical tour now. Authors like Albert Roboteau, in his books Slave Religion and Canaan Land, described the black church as the invisible institution. It provided the infrastructure for organizing long before organizing was legal. Prior to emancipation, the black church was the place where liberation theologies were born, as well as theologies of passive resistance and rebellion against the status quo. The book I have highlighted there from David Robertson is on Denmark Vesey. If you're not familiar with Denmark Vesey, his rebellion, but Denmark Vesey in my faith in my faith tradition, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, I'll tell you a brief story of significance for me at least. Our denomination owns the oldest parcel of real estate owned by African Americans in the United States of America. It's Mother Bethel AME Church in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 6 in Lombard Streets. The denomination was proliferating in the Northeast and in the Midwest, and when it moved into the South, the first church established, Denmark Vesey was one of the founders of it. It was Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, hopefully that name is familiar to you, because if nothing else, you'll recall in June 2015, a sick racist decided he was going to kill 9 people in a Bible study at Emanuel AME Church, but Denmark Vesey was one of that congregation's founders. A church that I previously pastored before my current pastoral appointment, when the AME Church started to move into the deep South. You can't get any deeper than Louisiana because you'll be in the water, right? When the church moved into the deep South, the first church it established was historic St. James AME Church in downtown New Orleans, which was founded in 1844. But nonetheless, my point of reference is that there was prophetic leadership that rose up during enslavement because there were liberation theologies. This is the counterside of what I've been talking about before. This is the counterside. There were liberation theologies that were birthed as a part of religious freedom. Henry Mcneill Turner, here we are in the state of Georgia. Henry Mcneill Turner was a Georgia legislator during Reconstruction. He was the 12th elected and consecrated bishop of the AME Church. He planted many, many AME churches here in the state of Georgia. A true freedom fighter, someone who believed in liberation theology, someone who believed in African-American empowerment, someone who believed much more so, if I can almost be proverbial, in the Exodus story opposed to the Romans 13 story. Did you catch that? Much more so than religion says to bow down and be subservient to others, he believed much more so that religion motivates us, as it did the Israelites, to rise up against the dominant classes, right? So I'm lifting him up particularly because we're here in the great state of Georgia. But during this period now, after enslavement, during this period of Reconstruction, you start to see the church, this is religious liberty, you start to see the church rise up, particularly the black church, rise up with the spirit of independence that said, God told you to own slaves? Well, guess what? God told us this is our country too, and we fought to build this country so there will be freedom and equity and justice, and we're willing to fight for it in America. Other examples of prophetic leadership during Reconstruction. Hiram Revels was the first African American elected to the United States Senate, and he was elected from Mississippi. He must have said Massachusetts. He must have said Maine. Did he say Mississippi? Elected from as we used to say in Louisiana, M-I, crooked letter I, M-I. Okay, he was elected from Mississippi back in 1870. He was a minister in the AME Church. I actually have had the pleasure of visiting the congregation he served several times. He was part of a movement in Reconstruction that showed independence, it showed prosperity, and it also started to spur, I believe, envy, resentment. There is a sermon I preached a little bit back from Exodus 14, 5 through 8, where Pharaoh has now released the Egyptians, Pharaoh has now released the Israelites. He's looking at the land as it is now, and he says, we want our country back. What have I done? How am I to make a profit now that these people are gone? How am I to remain in power now that I don't have this subservient class? So Pharaoh mounts up his chariots and says, we want our country back. My words, not in the text, right? But this is what we saw in 1877 when the troops were withdrawn from the South. And in so many words, people said, we want America back when we move past the period of Reconstruction. In moving past Reconstruction in 1877, we start to get the religion of a lost cause, a romanticization. We start to romanticize what enslavement was like. It wasn't that bad. They had food. They had a place to sleep. They wanted it. Certainly it wasn't that bad, right? There's a romanticization here again with second-class citizenship. Again, slave owners justified enslavement with religious liberty because it was my God-ordained right to own this chattel property. This is one side of the religious spectrum, and I'm deliberately trying to demonstrate that there are two very distinct sides. But we start to see again a feeling of division, a real feeling of division, largely emanating from the church, based on the philosophies arising from religious liberty. When you fast forward to 1896, we then move to a philosophy of separation. When the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education, separate but equal. Many people attempted to justify this by saying, this is what the Lord intended. Obviously here in the South, I don't need to tell folks about the Southern history, but this is what the Lord intended for the races to be separate, for us not to have, we weren't using the language of reconciliation back then, but for us not to have what we would say now as at least racial reconciliation. God intended separation, and here the institution of Jim Crow was birthed, right? Separate but never equal. And if you look at the imagery at the top there, the two justices, from 1896 with Plessy v. Ferguson, it was not overturned until 1954 with Brown v. Board of Education, right? Here we come into the ping pong phase, right? Let's get athletic with it. We're going to play ping pong with religion. Now, FDR rises to power in the midst of a Great Depression, in the midst of poverty as never seen before. Whenever there is tragedy, there's always opportunity. So that means this is opportunity for people to come to the church because they need wholesome nurture right now, right? FDR elected in 32 after the stock market crash of 1929, and his religious populism vilified corporate America using religious language. The money changers have now fled the temple, and it is our duty to love our neighbor. Okay, you start to see the seeds here. It works on both sides is what I'm trying to say, right? It works on both sides. So the game of ping pong starts with a social version of Christianity on what will become the more proverbial left in response to, or creating, I should say, an enemy on the political right. Not a whole lot to say about religious liberty in action under Truman, save for the concept of American exceptionalism really was on display with the military and how we fared under the leadership of a general by the name of Dwight David Eisenhower. Under him, however, under his presidency, everything started to change. Inauguration Day in 1953, we see manifest destiny and Christian nationalism start to conflate. This is when under God is added to the Pledge of Allegiance. This is when in God we trust is added to our currency. We really start to see the hand of God on the people of America, and we are chosen, and anything that is against us is against God. Am I making sense in terms of the foundation I'm trying to lay? Okay. All right. So you really see, and you see the imagery here. This is Billy Graham, right? Everybody recognizes this is Billy Graham. This is the Great Crusader. So we are tied together with the most popular religious figure in the United States, and the President of the United States are hand in hand in promoting a civil religion, is all I can call it at this point, in promoting a civil religion. Now, at the same time, I've been deliberate in trying to show two sides of a coin. At the same time where there was an American exceptionalism and a civil religion, if we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, all must mean all. So the church, the black church, gave us the civil rights movement as a part of religious liberty, because there are certain theological doctrines that I'm going to talk about in just a moment that suggest we are supposed to rise up against a dominant class because God wants equality among all God's people. That's when you start moving into the New Testament conversation on reconciliation. When you think about it, regardless of, I've written in both contexts. I've written saying that the civil rights movement arguably came from the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. I've written saying that the civil rights movement arguably came from the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Either way you slice it, there are different views on it. Either way you slice it, it came from the church. Why am I saying the church? Because Brown, who brought suit, her father was a minister at St. Mark AME Church in Topeka, Kansas. This was part of the liberation theology to rise up. This was rising up in a legal context and taking things to court, opposed to rising up in a prophetic context by taking things to the street. But also, religion influenced the action of Rosa Parks and the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. because there was an undergirding of civil disobedience, a civil disobedience that is traced not so much to Henry David Thoreau, but a civil disobedience that is traced to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when we talk about the biblical influence of rising up against unjust systems, when, as Dr. King wrote so well from Letter from Birmingham Jail, an unjust law is no law at all. So, religion influences voting. Religion influences civil participation. I'm going to talk in the next lecture a little bit about David Walker's appeal and how David Walker's appeal infused the basis for a great division among the African American faith community. There's some who wanted to be separatists or nationalists, if you will, and there's some who wanted to be integrationalist. From the integrationist perspective, Dr. King is the poster child of integrationalist. He says, or integrationalism, he believed if every action has a reaction, and America played ping pong from 55 to 2020 going up, prophetic Christianity, when African Americans became engaged in the freedom struggle, gave a white lash in 1968. The Evangelical Alliance with the religious right, that was seeds that were planted in 1968. That alliance lasted until the 2020 election. I'm saying it lasted, past tense, until the 2020 election, because as I'm going to unpack, there are some cracks, I believe, in it that we have not seen since the seeds were sown in 1968 and really solidified in 1980. But this is a picture of where I'm going now in terms of the reaction that came from the progressive nature of the civil rights movement. I want to touch on reconciliation and what that means or has meant for religious liberty and for the pursuit of justice and fairness. In his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, Dr. King wrote about salvific and social, the salvific and social planes of the cross. So if you use the imagery there of the cross and use reconciliation terminology, it says that, from a Christian perspective, it says that humanity is reconciled in its relationship to God through Jesus. Through Jesus' sacrificial suffering, humanity is reconciled in its relationship to God. It also says that humans are equal to one another. All of us are equal to one another because of Jesus. It says that the church wasn't just birthed to address salvation in the kingdom to come, but the church was also birthed to address social inequities and to be a witness for social justice here in the kingdom at hand. So when you look at these two planes of the cross, Dr. King used to say, the church should never be so heavenly holy that she can be no earthly good. This is part of religious freedom rising up to give liberty to those who have been marginalized. To speak specifically about this is largely in my work, Call to Reconciliation. With the image of those two planes of the cross, prophetic Christianity was rooted in a threefold reconciliation theology: salvific, social, and civil. Salvific reconciliation, again, reconciles humans with God through Jesus, vertical plane of the cross. Social reconciliation reconciles humans to one another because of Jesus. And then civil reconciliation, which is where I'm going now. Civil reconciliation is a cousin, if not a sibling, of social reconciliation, and it demands equality through prophetic activism. This is part of the church, and this is how the church has influenced society at large. Now, religious liberty says, I mentioned before, I'm going to unpack the theology behind suffering. Religious liberty and a willingness to suffer says, from Isaiah 53, it provides a core theology for the civil rights movement. King often said that suffering is redemptive. Listen to this. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. That is messianic in the context that Isaiah was writing about the Messiah who would come. But it looks at suffering as being redemptive, is the point I'm making. Suffering for a greater cause is redemptive. The same rationale, I would argue, although not religious or not nearly as religious, but the same rationale of a willingness to put one's own personal self, put one's body at issue, to make a sacrifice, is what motivated many of the contemporary protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement that we saw on display over the last several years, particularly in 2020. Are we all together? I'm nervous because you all are so quiet. We all together. I just want to make sure we're together. Okay, all right, okay. Thank you, all right. Okay, what does religious liberty look like? What does it look like when God motivates you to put your physical self at issue for something that's greater than yourself, to imitate the sufferings of Christ? It looks like young people who are doing lunch counter sit-ins in the 1960s because Christ died for all of us, and we all are equal to one another. It looks like people who are willing to ride buses to test laws of interstate commerce that discriminate based on race, knowing those buses will be firebombed, doing their wills and I'm looking at the demographics in the room, and I'm willing to bet, looking at ages more than anything else. I know there's some 20-year-olds in here. I know there's some early 30-year-olds in here. When you look at the history of the Freedom Rides in 1961, Diane Nash and others who were college students at Fisk and the like, they were early 20s, and who gave proclamations on, we went to have our wills drafted before going on these trips. Did you hear me? We have moved, and much of truth is made in jest, we've moved now to a culture in America where I'm guilty of it too. You want to contact me? Sure, I have an iPhone. I read and I preach from my iPad, and you can even email me at jaugustine@me.com. We've moved into such an individual-focused society that our willingness to suffer for something much greater than us is almost a generation removed. But we saw quite a bit of that come back with the Black Lives Matter protests. Protests that I'm optimistic about because they were not limited. They were not one race protests. They were multi-ethnic. They were multi-racial. They were multi-generational. But nonetheless, I'm lifting up here religious liberty undergirded this willingness to sacrifice in the course of the civil rights movement for the concept of freedom and justice. We're approaching Good Friday. In 1963, King was arrested for parading without a permit by Police Commissioner Bull Connor, who refused to issue the permit. In Letter from Birmingham Jail, King was very clear. Again, I referenced the Hebrew boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in giving a biblical justification for his civil disobedience, citing St. Augustine, my namesake, right? Citing St. Augustine, an unjust law is no law at all. This is part of how religious liberty, how the free exercise, how the free interpretation of religion has influenced people in civil protest and in politics. Ultimately, the great sacrificial suffering we saw John Lewis on his knees there, rest his soul for the work he's done, long before he was in Congress, but March the 7th, 1965, in Selma, Alabama, the day we know as Bloody Sunday. John Lewis's skull was cracked and he was taken to Good Samaritan Hospital. Obviously, he went on to a very prosperous career as a freedom fighter. But all of the suffering done by ordained clergy members and others, members of the laity who were very engaged, obviously, all of the suffering led to the power of the franchise. And you see Dr. King there casting his ballot after passage of the Voting Rights Act. So, by way of a quick summary, we have looked at the Montgomery bus boycott and its theological underpinnings. We've looked at a civil disobedience as articulated by King in Letter from Birmingham Jail, and we've looked at probably the most prominent example of suffering that led to a redemptive measure, if you will, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, by looking at how religion has influenced society through the free exercise of religion, particularly on the prophetic, the more left of center side of religion. Any questions on where we have been thus far? We all together? All right. Now, let's pivot. The response to the civil rights movement, the response of the progress, a response to the progress made. Here we see President Nixon campaigning there, Tricky Dick they used to call him. I'm not a crook, right? I can joke, he was president when I was born. I had a great affection for Nixon. But anyway, so Nixon and Billy Graham, there's that Billy Graham again, right? So Nixon sowed seeds with what was called the Southern strategy. And how do we drive wedge issues? This was long before critical race theory. There was another wedge issue of African Americans now moving into our cities. Wait a minute, let's move out to the suburbs. The Southern strategy started to take root, but Nixon obviously had to leave office for some other reasons. The seeds that he sowed, however, really came to pass with the charming, the charismatic candidacy of Ronald Reagan, the Gipper. The religious right that was rising here with Jerry Falwell and the evangelicals, or their courting of evangelicals, I should say, white evangelical Christians, really came together in the 1980 presidential election And Reagan makes the famous quote, I know you can't endorse me, but I sure endorse you. There is now a marriage on political issues, very conservative issues, with their man in the White House. And Reagan was sly enough, crafty enough, charismatic enough, where he knew where his votes were coming from, so he was carrying the Falwell agenda. So we see the actions of the civil rights movement drawing the reactions here with a rise of the religious right. The prophet stands to speak truth to power. But whenever there are actions, there are reactions. All of this prophetic preaching, all of this speaking out for social justice, you must be against the laws of America. So if you're against America, you're against God. And we start to see a rise of people who say, I'm taking a stance for God. A rise of political candidates like Judge Roy Moore, formerly of the Supreme Court in Alabama, who was kicked off the court and decided he was going to run for the U.S. Senate because he wanted to conflate cross and country such to the point that we've got to have the 10 Commandments in every public place out here. The church and state, there's no separation. This is God's country. We're ordained by God, so people have to speak out for these Christian values. Remember, this is a Christian nation. Forget all of the stuff I talked about at the first part of the lecture, right? We now are a Christian nation. History doesn't matter. We're going to rewrite history. So we start to see Christian nationalism rising up to defend, quote unquote, the power structure, as the other side of Christianity, the prophetic side of Christianity, is speaking truth to the power structure. Clear lines of division. Christian nationalism really conflates God and America. I'm not saying they're necessarily separate, but you cannot conflate them for political theology or ideology. It has been very deliberate in courting with a wedge issue, again, Roe v. Wade, being very deliberate in courting good, God-fearing people who have been a part of a movement largely behind the one issue of abortion. Largely behind the one issue of abortion. We have seen this fusion that Reagan solidified after Nixon's seeds were sown. We've seen this fusion last, I say again, until the 2020 election, when I think the transgressions, I think the problems, I think the personal transgressions, I think the issues of the 2020 candidate for re-election were just a bit much for everybody to stand together. So you have a faction of evangelicals who have broken away and who's saying we want to do some things differently. And you also have the Christian nationalists who say, this is our man, God sent him, we're willing to take over this country if necessary because God told us to. It's still a very polarizing place. We're seeing two sides of the equation is my point. So if Christian nationalism is a theme or is a lens that defends power and defends the status quo, if it creates an us versus them, if you're them, you're absolutely against us. And we wouldn't do certain things. So all of the books on the Holocaust, let's take those out of the libraries, get those off the shelves because that stuff didn't happen. We're going to rewrite history through this lens of maintaining power. And absolutely, all your attempts in elementary school and in secondary school to talk about critical race theory, we're going to end all of that now because that's our issue for campaigns. Again, I can assure you, I studied critical race theory in law school. It is not, as I say to the congregation sometimes, somebody say not. It is not being discussed in elementary schools, secondary schools, and high schools. It's simply not. It's a wedge issue that is being used to maintain power. That is the essence of what Christian nationalism does. It's an attempt to maintain power, and in this case, to unwrite history. More on actions and reactions. If you think about the white lash, you think about the pendulum swinging back and forth, right? Just like the pendulum swung after Dr. King and the success of the civil rights movement that gave us Nixon and the Southern Strategy, the pendulum swung after President Obama and it gave us, let's make America great again. Well, what just do you mean by that? Where do we go from here? There is empirical data that shows America has become much, much more secularized than she ever was before. The MAGA movement, however, caused a tremendous break with many in the evangelical community. If I can share with you, I am excited. I'm optimistic. The book I wrote, Call to Reconciliation, very much brings in the undertones of politics, not just, theological reconciliation, but political reconciliation. Is multifaceted. I'm very excited because probably a much more right of center church group has invited me in October. The Center for Pastor Theologians has invited me to be one of the speakers at their annual conference up in Chicago. I'm very excited about that because there's an implied and I think an express recognition that politics has run some good people, and I'm talking about evangelicals here, politics has run some good people off the reservation, and I think they've been misled by some very slick and cunning politicians, and there is a collective sense of how do we get back now to where we really are supposed to be in terms of our service to God. But I'm excited because I've been invited to be a part of that conversation. So that lets me know that the damage that was done in 2020, I should be an optimist because we can move in a much better direction because arguably we can't move in any worse a direction, right? The Black Lives Matter protests of 2020, I'm optimistic based on what we saw there because the demographics show that this is not just one race. They were called Black Lives Matter protests because they were in response to the killings of unarmed black people, but they were not just one race, one part of a demographic that were out protesting. They were multicultural, they were multi-generational, they were people coming together, embracing, if you will, the prophetic side of what we've seen in religious liberty that says, if we hold these truths to be self-evident, says the Great Declaration, that all people are created equal, then all must mean all. The January 6th insurrection was all about defending God's will. When you think about the people who went to the Capitol, they were there, expressed it because this is our man. This can't be. God sent him for 2 terms. Those ballots must have been false. They must have been stealing. They must have been. The funny thing is when they started talking about the places where alleged fraud was going on, only in Atlanta, only in Philadelphia, only in Milwaukee, not in any other places. And I started to think about the demographics of those urban communities. I say, aha, okay. At any rate, the Stop the Steal hyperbole has also caused a response in Christian nationalism because we're defending America and consequently we are defending God's will. This is part of the theology that's infusing where we are. I am open. I've tried to talk as fast as I can. Hopefully this was as lively as it could have been. I want to engage questions. I've attempted to be disquieting. I've attempted to be provocative. I want to engage you. What do you have to say in response to what I've said? Amen. All right. Can I get a witness? Thank you so much. I'm teasing. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Do you view the rise of Christian nationalism as a counter, as an attempted counter to civil rights movement?
No, not necessarily. I think there's some dangerous seeds that have been there all along, and that's part of what I tried to illustrate. That the conflation of cross and country has been for political gain by many, and there are many good people. I'm one of them. I'm a proud veteran of the United States Army. I was an infantry officer in the United States Army, right? Which means I went out to sacrifice my life for my country, and I believe in my country, right? I also believe in God. I'm a Christian. I'm obviously a Christian minister. But in my mind, I can adequately separate those things because I have love here, I have love there. But when I conflate the two and I say that anybody who's against America is against God, that's a big step. And when I say that anyone who is against the laws as set up in America for the original patriarchal system, if you are attempting to change those laws, then you must be against God too. That's another step, right? I'm not prepared to make those steps. So I don't necessarily think that the rise of Christian nationalism is directly in response to the civil rights movement, but I think it is being used by those who are against liberation, full democratic participation, expanded democracy. I think it's being used by others to be a part of to be in their arsenal of weapons, if you will. Thank you for the question, too. How are we doing on time? We have like 5 minutes before, 10 minutes before this session is over. Y'all quiet on me. You make me nervous when you're quiet. Okay. Okay, all good. No worries, no worries. I hope I didn't bore you to death. When people are quiet, I feel like we bored. Yes, sir.
You showed some iconic
Wow. Great question, my God. In the book, in Call to Reconciliation, when I introduced the paradigm of the Southern strategy, I'm very specific in using that quote, Nixon ran on the platform of law and order, right? So all of the protest of the civil rights movement were painted as lawlessness. You can use veiled tropes to vilify without having to say race, but everybody knows what you mean. Those people who are out there protesting, they are against America. Those people. Well, my goodness gracious, those people must be bad. Somebody else buys into that logic, right? Nixon was very deliberate in running a campaign and saying he was going to restore law and order to the lawlessness we saw in America. We saw a lot of that with Ronald Reagan, and I read an interesting book recently called Jesus and John Wayne. Has anyone read that? Wonderful read, right? Wonderful read. And she shows how Christianity has used, how many Christian leaders have used this toxic masculinity. You know, we're coming at you with the church, we're coming at you, right? Very interesting, but much in the same way that Jimmy Carter was portrayed as soft. And Reagan was the macho machismo guy who was going to restore law and order, considering everything that was going on with the scandals and so forth then. But yes, that certainly the law and order politics certainly have been there. So if you use that and you think about the imagery of restoring law and order in response to religious liberty, in response to God told me to take these rights, God told me to take these actions, it creates an inherent tension, and I think we have seen that tension play out decade after decade after decade in America. Thank you very much. Any other comment or question? Yes, sir.
This is good because it impacts the life of local congregations, how local congregations can respond in their own community to these kinds of issues. And how do faith communities address the tensions of race in their own communities, the issues of religious liberty in their own communities? What's the model for that local level?
You know, I am from New Orleans, and I love gumbo. I love food, right? I have been very deliberate in sharing that a common meal at a table can break down so many barriers. I say that just illustratively to say if we're willing to just take the temperature down, and if we're willing to engage in dialogue with others and to try to understand someone's position from an empathic point of view opposed to a defensive point of view, we can solve the world's problems. I am very appreciative. Pastor Scott is sitting behind you. I'm very appreciative of the church family at First Baptist here in Macon. Last night, praise the Lord, they say, hey, we want to read Call to Reconciliation. Well, praise the Lord, Pastor Scott, right? Okay, so my attempt at levity, but much of truth is made in jest, right? So I'm delighted when groups come together, church groups and otherwise, and they say we want to have a common read and we want to talk, we want to engage in discourse, recognizing there's an inherent problem, but we want to talk about how we can bring people together. I think also the church has got to be an exemplar for the rest of the world because there are certain morals that are supposed to govern people in the church, certain expectations about mutual respect, et cetera, that we profess to be a part of our theology and our common treatment of others, or how we hold others. I think we're supposed to be the exemplar for society, and hopefully society can want to emulate us rather than pointing a finger at us and saying, look how hypocritical, they're in the church and they're doing worse than we're doing and we're not in the church, right? So that's my perspective, at least as a minister. But to directly answer your question, I think coming together and finding a place where you don't have to always agree, but you never have to be disagreeable, I think that is the start to really solving problems. My humble opinion. Yes, ma'am.
I know you talked about like voter suppression earlier, and I was wondering if the people who conflate Christianity with America and being like ordained by God, if there's people in power making laws and passing stuff in Congress, if they think that way, how do you even like go about choosing? But sometimes we're like stuck in there.
Yeah. So this is why I think democracy is really at risk. The true nature of democracy being at risk in America because it's being hijacked by an agenda. I don't think all people who are subverting the will of the American people in elected office are Christian nationalists, but I think that politics makes for strange bedfellows. I think people will align themselves with others if it will get them to be proverbial to 50% plus one, right? I think politics makes for very strange bedfellows. I do think there is something to be said about the direct connection of Christian nationalism and it being a political ideology that's about preserving power, and then saying, well, we don't care what democracy said, we don't care what the numbers say, we don't care who voted, we don't care the fact that everybody had a chance to vote and the election results are clear. January 6th, let's take over. Let's take things over. I think that's very problematic. And I think the continuation of that comes about with respect to the voter suppression legislation I referenced, because you know, I can tell you all day long something that's not true, and I can say it 10 times, doesn't make it true. I'm wearing a black suit today. Is that black he's wearing? I'm wearing a gray suit. I'm wearing a black suit today. I'm wearing a black suit. I'm wearing a black suit. I don't care how many times I say it, it's not going to become a black suit. So no matter how many times we say there was election fraud, there was election fraud, there was election fraud, it was not election fraud. But people have bought into the propaganda of that in this narrative of stop the steal. And the voter suppression laws, I'm going to talk in detail about that in the next presentation, have made it much more onerous for people to vote than it's ever been before. In many cases, there's a such thing as out-of-precinct voting. Out-of-precinct voting, very quickly, just to give you an example of this. Out-of-precinct voting, I did an amicus brief at the U.S. Supreme Court in the case a year and a half ago. We were unsuccessful, but out-of-precinct voting says that we will allow you on a given day. Think about somebody who's a waged employee opposed to a salaried employee, right? If you're salaried, you say, oh my goodness, I hadn't had a chance to vote yet. Hey, I'll be back in an hour, so I'm going to vote. I'm going to get a lunch. Okay, you have no price to pay. You're not giving up anything because you have to go vote, right? But if you are a waged employee, you having to vote across town where you live opposed to in the area where you work literally is a poll tax, because you're losing money to go vote, right? So out-of-precinct voting says that in the same city, the municipal elections, you should be able to vote. You may not be able to vote, but in the congressional election, you vote, you cast. In the presidential, the gubernatorial election, votes you cast. In the presidential election, your vote you count, right? But the Supreme Court's recent ruling says if you don't vote in your own precinct, none of it counts. None of it does. That is one example of voter suppression. Voter ID laws are also, I can walk that dog all day long. Voter ID laws are incredibly onerous, and as the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal has said with respect to the North Carolina General Assembly, they have targeted African Americans, quote unquote, with surgical precision. Not my language, that's the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal. But I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was gonna say, it's like, it's funny because one of the things, not only, but the major way to change things is by voting, and they can't vote.
Is this, whoop, whoop, whoop. You see the dog chasing his tail? Whoop, 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 whoop. That's a dog chasing his tail. It'll never catch itself, right? It'll never. Yes, therein lies the rub. Therein lies the rub, exactly. Any other, how we doing on time? We okay? Did I bore you to death? Are we all right? Okay, thank you for your time. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Shurdens. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you. I appreciate you greatly.